You know, it's always seemed strange to me to call the remembrance of the execution of Jesus Christ a Good Friday. But I guess if we really understand the full ramifications and think about it, what happened on that Friday, at least from our perspective, it was a really Good Friday. The law of sin and death was done away with. It was at least completed. Man's sin, woman's sin, the sons of Adam and Eve's sin were atoned for through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on that Friday. The fulfillment of the first part of what Jeremiah was told by God was a gracious promise made to his people long ago. That's Jeremiah 33:14. A promise that God made not only to Jeremiah, but to scores of people many times in the ancient past, and they recorded it. Partially fulfilled, just partially, during Passover week in Jerusalem about 2,000 years ago. This virgin-born son of Mary, described by the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament writers as coming from eternity past, described by the writer and Jesus himself as the great I am, described by John as the living Word of God, the visible representation, if you will, of the unseen power that strides the galaxies. To the Romans, he was just another first century Jewish rabbi that caused some problems that they took care of. But as I've noted many times, this Jewish rabbi was no ordinary Jewish rabbi. He could walk on water. And I like this really well. He really knew where to fish. He did. He could control the weather. He could create food. He could heal the sick. He could cast out demons. And he could even raise the dead, as he demonstrated. This divine being came to earth about 2,000 years ago, disguised again as an ordinary man, and offered himself up as an atoning, substitutionary sacrifice that would end the need of the Jewish sacrificial system, which had really just been pointing to this point in time, this so-called Good Friday. He did all this to satisfy his own sense of justice and to pay himself a cosmic penalty with his own life, to redeem his prized creation from the law of sin and death and spiritual separation from God. The Creator died for his beloved creation, but he didn't stay dead. You know the rest of the story. He came alive again, or at least part of the rest of the story. He came alive again after 2 nights and part of 3 days in a tomb. But that's Sunday stuff. This is Friday. So let's talk about Friday stuff for a few minutes. But one more note. Someday, Jesus will return visibly and powerfully to fulfill the remainder of that gracious promise that was made to our ancient ancestors and establish his kingdom on this earth forever. But again, that's definitely another story for another time. Right now, the story I need to tell is the story of the arrest, the trial, and the execution of Jesus Christ as recorded by 2 eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and 2 other early church historians, Mark, who got his information from Peter, an eyewitness himself, and Luke, who was Paul's personal physician, and he said he interviewed many eyewitnesses. The story. After Jesus finished the celebration of the Seder meal, the Passover meal, probably on a Thursday night, he turned it, by the way, into a celebration of the sacrifice that he would make the next day, the life-giving sacrifice. And we're going to celebrate what he turned it into at the end of this talk. We call it communion, the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist. After all that had happened, after all of his teaching to his 12 disciples, his final teaching, after his prayer in that upper room of a Jewish home in Jerusalem, he left with 11 of his disciples to walk about a mile to the northeast across the Kidron Valley to a spot he'd gone several times before, kind of a favorite prayer place of his called the Mount of Olives, and a garden up there called the Garden of Gethsemane, or Garden of Olive Trees. He went up there to be alone and pray while his disciples were nearby. Judas, the disciple who would betray him, who had really already betrayed him, had left earlier that evening to rendezvous with a group of soldiers and others to lead them to Jesus so they could arrest him. When Judas and the soldiers arrived, Jesus went out to meet them, and he asked them boldly who they wanted. And they answered, Jesus of Nazareth. And he replied, I am he. And his voice and his presence scared them so bad they fell to the ground and retreated. Again, he asked them, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus. And he said, let my disciples go. But Peter impetuously drew a sword and swung at one of the soldiers and cut off his right ear. Jesus healed the man's ear and told Peter to put up his sword. There would be a time for the sword sometime in the future, but not now. Jesus told Peter he intended to drink the cup of wrath that the Father himself had poured for Jesus to drink. The disciples fled, and Jesus was taken into custody. Jesus came to earth from heaven to redeem the fallen race of Adam, to buy them back from slavery they'd been sold into because of their own poor choices, to say the least. An evil antagonist called Satan, and to buy for himself, using a Bible metaphor, a bride that would love him back, called the church. Now the hour had come to pay for that bride with his own life, according to laws, universal law that he and his Father had written. The soldiers took Jesus first to the home of a man named Annas, who had been the high priest. And some of those soldiers were Jews themselves. Some were some of Herod's soldiers. And so they took him to Annas' home, where he was interrogated and beaten. Now, Annas really wasn't the high priest. The Romans had deposed him and appointed Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the high priest. So then they went to Caiaphas' house. In both houses, Jesus was interrogated, ridiculed, and beaten. Finally, he ended up at Pilate's home. But before they get there, at one of the high priest's homes, something interesting happened. One of his disciples and his close friends, Peter, was hanging around trying to find out what was going to happen to Jesus. And 3 times, servants of one of the high priests asked Peter if he knew Jesus. They thought he was one of his disciples. Peter denied it emphatically, even cursing one time. And a rooster crowed, as Jesus had prophesied earlier that day would happen, and Peter ran away crying. Again, because the Jews were living in an occupied country now and subject to Roman law, they had no authority to execute someone. The Jewish leaders took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem. Pilate questioned Jesus, learned he was a native of Galilee. That's an area outside Pilate's jurisdiction. He also knew that Herod Antipas, a half-Jew who was over that area, was in town for the Passover. And you know, I hope, if you don't, I'll tell you that Herod Antipas is the guy that had executed Jesus' cousin earlier, John the Baptist. Again, Herod was in Jerusalem. So Pilate thought he had found a way out of this mess. He didn't like it. And so he sent Jesus to Herod, hoping to put the decision off on Herod. When Jesus got to Herod's palace, he refused to even speak to him. He had spoken to Annas, to Caiaphas, and to Pilate. He'd had conversations with those 3 men, but he had utterly no regard, no respect for Herod, so he wouldn't even speak to him. Herod and his guards mocked and ridiculed Jesus, then sent him back to Pilate. Pilate questioned Jesus further, even defended Jesus to the Jewish leaders, saying he found no fault in the man, no reason to execute him. The Jewish leaders demanded that he crucify Jesus, which was the Roman form of execution. Pilate had Jesus then beaten nearly to death to try to appease the Jewish leaders, but it didn't appease them. They wanted him killed. They argued ridiculously that Jesus claimed to be a king, and they had no king but Caesar. Finally, Pilate turned Jesus over to appease the Jewish leaders to Roman soldiers to be executed, to be crucified. The soldiers made a crown of thorns and mocked Jesus more, and forced him to carry his own cross, probably a cross beam. But he was too weak to carry it all the way in his humanity. and he stumbled and fell. So the soldiers impressed an African man named Simon to carry it the rest of the way. The place of execution was a hill outside of town called Golgotha. They stripped Jesus naked, the Roman soldiers did, and nailed and tied him to a cross. Then they placed a sign over his head, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Pilate had ordered it. The Jewish leaders were infuriated, but Pilate wouldn't take it down. Then, in fulfillment of ancient prophecies that those soldiers knew nothing about, those Roman soldiers just gambled for Jesus' clothing at the foot of the cross. Jesus was crucified between two criminals, career thieves. By their own testimony, their own conversations with each other, they knew they deserved what they were getting. One thief mocked Jesus. The other asked Jesus to remember him after his death. Jesus did an astounding thing that gives us all incredible hope and encouragement, me at least. He said to that thief before the day was over, because of his faith, the two of them, the thief and Jesus, would be together in paradise. While Jesus was hanging on the cross, he saw his disciple John standing by his mother and his aunt and some other women. And Jesus asked John to simply take care of my mama when I'm gone. Crucifixion was a slow, agonizing death. Sometimes men lasted for up to 2 days on the cross. Jesus was put on the cross about 9 o'clock in the morning on a Friday and died about 3 p.m. He may have died quicker because he was beaten so badly before he was crucified. The gospel writers indicate that Jesus spoke very little while he was on the cross. Well, we know of only 7 things or 7 sayings he said from the cross. He asked his Father to forgive his tormentors, which is incredibly important. He said he was thirsty. And then he cried out to God the why question. It's a question that probably some of us are crying right now in the midst of this coronavirus crisis. Why have I lost my job? Why is my wealth in jeopardy? Why are some of my friends possibly going to die? Some of my family members. Why? People have been asking that question throughout human history as we dealt with the effects of sin and the curse on all of us and on creation. And Jesus was asking the why question. Father, why has it come to this? Why have you forsaken me specifically is what he said. But as he was dying, he was resolved. He said this, it is finished, speaking to his Father, and into your hands I commit my spirit. While Jesus was on the cross, the sky became as dark as night. There was an earthquake, and the curtain that separated the innermost part of the Jewish temple from the rest of the temple was torn in two. At this point, I want to put the story on pause just for a few minutes. I want to put things again in a larger context. I know I've been saying this throughout the talk, but I want to say it again. It was God himself that required the blood of a perfect sacrifice to pay for the sins of humanity and appease God's own sense of justice. According to the spiritual laws of the universe, and there are spiritual laws of the universe, just like there are physical laws in the universe, there are spiritual laws. And according to the spiritual laws of the universe, a cosmic penalty was required to pay for a cosmic debt, a blood sacrifice of a perfect being. God wrote himself into the story, not just as the lover and the creator, but as the redeemer, the sin sacrifice. And that debt was created by our ancient ancestors joining with God's enemy in a rebellion against God and his value system. And we too have joined in that rebellion. The first hint of this spiritual law of what's called atonement, being related to blood, was a scene from Genesis 3 in the ancient past back in a garden, where God made garments of skin from animals that he'd killed to give Adam and Eve a covering or clothing. If you'll recall, animals were not given to man originally as food. That was probably after the flood. But God took the life of the animals. These skins came again from animals sacrificed. They sacrificed their lives because of Adam and Eve's sin and rebellion. I want you to listen to these words. I did this last year this time, and I almost deleted this, but I decided not to. Listen to these words from a song called The Sacrifice from a few years ago. In the land of God's first heartache, where our line of sin began, and the eyes of man were opened to the evil there at hand. The Creator heard their footsteps, but He didn't see the man. And God called out for an answer, but they turned away and ran. An attempt in desperation to be hid from holy eyes was to fashion out their own garment that could hide them in disguise. But the Father bled compassion, and with a fast, forgiving hand, took the life of one yet blameless and made a covering for the man. Offer up the sacrifice. Creation sends forth its call. One holy sacrifice, one life to pay for the fall. Offer up the sacrifice. The innocent one must be slain, someone to pay the price and bring man back to God again. On a hill outside Jerusalem, where sin had took its toll, hung the life of one as blameless as those garden beasts of old. And He bled with God's compassion for the evil man had done. And the heart that cried, "Forgive them," was the heart of God's own Son, the broken heart of God's own Son. Again, offer up the sacrifice. Creation is sending forth the call. One holy sacrifice, one life to pay for the fall. Offer up the sacrifice. The innocent one must be slain, someone to pay the price and bring man back to God again. That song is just a reminder of what was really happening that awful Friday outside Jerusalem on that bloody hill. Now, back to that first century scene. About 3 p.m, the Jewish leaders asked the Roman soldiers to break the legs of the 3 men being crucified to allow them to suffocate and die, so they would not be hanging there during the Jewish Sabbath, which began at sundown on that Friday. And the soldiers agreed to do it, but when they got to Jesus, He was already dead, they thought, so they didn't bother to break His legs. Instead, a soldier just thrust a spear up under its ribs to be sure he was dead, and blood and bodily fluid poured out. Later, Jesus' body was taken down and given to a wealthy Pharisee, a guy by the name of Joseph, who was a secret follower of Jesus. He and his friend Nicodemus, another Jewish leader who had come earlier in the story by night to Jesus, they wrapped Jesus' body for burial and placed Him in a very expensive tomb, a cave in the rock nearby, and a large rock was put over the opening of this little cave to block the entryway. Pilate sent soldiers to guard the tomb, and everyone, and I mean everyone, all of His disciples and all of His followers, everybody thought it was over. It was an awful, a scandalous thing that humanity did that day on a hillside to its Creator outside of Jerusalem. What a strange way. What an incredibly strange way for the Creator to rescue His prized creation, the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. Why don't you go now, if you're not already, just put the video on pause. If you don't have bread and wine or juice with you, and we're going to take communion together. So just put the video on pause, go get the elements, and come back. Right now, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, regardless of your faith tradition, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, and you're trusting in His sacrificial and atoning death to give you life right now and a relationship with Him and eternal life in the future, then we're going to take the elements together, what we call the elements. The bread, the wafer, the pita bread, the tortilla, the cracker, whatever you've got that represents His broken body. The juice, the wine, whatever you're using, that represents the blood that was spilt for you. Let's take it and eat and drink it together right now. The body of Christ broken for you and me. The blood of Christ spilled for you and me. Let's take, eat, and remember, as Jesus asks us to, the sacrifice made on a Good Friday about 2,000 years ago by the Son of God and the Son of Man.